All right, so we're going to get started with talking about the various actors on the Phoenix Wright Rise from the Ashes cast list. And I suppose I should start with myself. To give a little background on myself, again, I'm Chapman University theater grad with stage emphasis theater performance degree. Pursuing voiceover. I've done a little anime dubbing. I've done a little ADR for a couple of direct-to-TV movies, and I've done a little web animation. And on a couple of these, I did actually get paid. So I have done a little bit of paid voiceover work. Still looking to do more, obviously, but that's where I'm at with my career at this stage of the game. As for why I ended up playing both Phoenix and Edgeworth, that's a funny story. I started when I originally thought of doing this project. I pegged myself for Edgeworth. That was my intention, was to play Edgeworth and not necessarily have me play Phoenix. When I was playing the game, as I mentioned, I would play the game and voice the characters as I go. I would do Phoenix and I would do Edgeworth. I'd do both of them, trade off, whatever have you. But in terms of what I thought I was going to do for this project, I figured I'll do Edgeworth because, well, he's my favorite character. He's, I think, a lot of people's favorite character. He's easily the ensemble dark horse of the series, and I'm not immune to that myself. I think I pegged him as the plum role, and so that's the role I wanted. But when this project started really coming into relief in terms of actually doing it, I originally intended for another actor to play Phoenix, but what I realized fairly early on to the process was that I actually really couldn't ask another actor to play Phoenix because there was so much difficulty implicit in terms of that role, because ultimately he has easily the most dialogue of anybody, obviously, and then on the flip side of that, his dialogue can be very functional as opposed to expository. Expository dialogue can be rewarding in its own way because it's just telling a story, but Phoenix's dialogue tends to be very response based. He tends to be kind of what you could actually relate it to, like Solid Snake in Metal Gear Solid. The kind of joke he's always doing, that Metal Gear kind of response lines, where he's just kind of taking in and parroting back all of the things that he gets told. So what that meant to me was that obviously the person who was playing Phoenix really needed to know this story inside and out. He needed to understand why Phoenix was saying everything he was saying, and every little bit of context as to why he was saying it. And so that I realized that this was something that would be very difficult for me to direct another actor doing, just in terms of that whole scheduling around everybody's lives kind of thing. And if I played Phoenix, that would just make it all the easier, because then that's a lot of difficulty, a lot of effort that I don't have to work on, because I can trust myself to know the story more than trying to have to trust myself to explain it to somebody else in terms of how to play Phoenix. And it's obviously such a huge role. So it was one of those things where it's like it becomes easier for me to put it up on myself than to do it with somebody else. But then the flip side of that is I did not want to give up Edgeworth, not in the slightest. Nobody's touching Edgeworth in a project that I'm doing. Hell no, Edgeworth is mine. So then it becomes that question of, all right, now I got to play Phoenix and Edgeworth, and the trick is me playing them both, especially in scenes where they're talking to each other. Ultimately, they both were recorded separately in that respect. I did not, when I was doing Edgeworth's recordings, I never did any Phoenix lines, and vice versa. For Phoenix, obviously, the voice was in no big shift from my own voice. It's pretty much my own voice. Phoenix, in terms of type, I wanted him to be a youthful man, but still a youthful man. Some people were surprised that he sounded as young as he did, but they reference throughout all the Phoenix Wright games, that he is still reasonably a young man, still kind of a rookie. And so, he does need to have that kind of youthfulness. So that wasn't hard. And we're in the general same age range. And so I didn't have to go out of my way to sound either older or younger for Phoenix. The real trick for the performance for me was to do the character's idealism and you know, his need, his desire to see things solved, coupled with his frustration and his sarcasm at the lunacy of the world around him, because he's easily the least crazy of everybody in the cast. So because of that, he's very sarcastic, but because he's so idealistic, he tends to keep that inside. So what that translated to in terms of performance for me is put a lot of the energy face forward. You know, it was really up here. I was like, okay, I need to figure this out. Come on, Gant, tell me why you didn't do this. You know, things like that. It was really just right up there, and that's where the performance came from. It wasn't a very created voice. It was a voice that was all about just the slight attitude shift into Phoenix's perspective, and just playing it really as a straight man. So that was what mild trickiness there was to Phoenix. Edgeworth, obviously, was a little bit more of a character. Obviously, there's the accent, and I pegged him for a British accent before I even knew there was any controversy about him having a British accent. He just seemed British to me. And for that matter, when it comes to choosing a British accent, you don't just choose a British accent. There are all sorts of British accents. You couldn't do Edgeworth with a Cockney accent, or even for that matter, a Scottish accent, or even a lilting like Welsh accent or something like that. It struck me as being necessary to do a received pronunciation accent. Received pronunciation is the most upper class, the most posh of all the British accents. It's the one that and you know, and Edgeworth is implicitly very upper class. They talk about him being very rich, and there was also a great snottiness, a great haughtiness to the received pronunciation accent, especially the way that I was doing it, and so that was something that I needed to consider. When I was creating that character, I emphasized that. And then the other thing that I liked about the RP accent, again, and how I particularly ended up doing it, was that when I would listen back to the tracks, I heard this kind of weakness, this kind of hollow self-doubt and a hatred of himself. Because that's the thing about Edgeworth. He is the most self-despising member of the entire Ace Attorney cast. He's the one who hates himself the most. And even though there's very little dialogue, almost no dialogue that actually directly references Edgeworth's emotional struggles in the case that happens right before Rise from the Ashes, which is the very famous Manfred von Karma DL6 case. I still wanted. I've played the entire games, all of the games, and so I was very cognizant of that throughout the Edgeworth performance. And I wanted you to hear that hatred of himself in all of his lines, even if he wasn't talking about it. I wanted that sense of, I killed my father, or for the longest time I thought I killed my father, to be a part of his psychological makeup. And so that was very much a touchstone for me in doing the character. That it was this self-loathing that he would mask up with this great, haughty, snotty, sarcastic attitude towards the rest of the world. And so that was where Edgeworth really came from for me, from a performance perspective. What that ultimately meant for me when I was differentiating them is I had to just depend on the acting, because both of them are in the same age range, of course, because they were both in the same 4th grade class. So I couldn't really pitch one up or down, and I tried both of them either up or down, and it didn't work. They just didn't sound right. They needed to both be at the vocal range that I was doing them naturally. So I couldn't differentiate the voices by virtue of playing with the pitch. So I had to depend on the acting, and I knew there were going to be times when they would sound fairly similar, and I chalked it up to them even to some extent being on the same page in certain occasions. But to what extent I did try to differentiate them as best as I possibly could, especially in the trial scenes, where, frankly, there are moments in the trial scenes where it just boils down to me yelling at myself across the room. That was all that happened in certain videos. Just Alex Weitzman versus Alex Weitzman. And the problem with that, of course, is particularly when you scream, the more you get screaming and scream, you get to that level, the more you scream, the closer you get to your own normal voice, even if you're trying to put on a voice. And so knowing that, I tried very hard to change and specify the way that I would scream for each character. So when Edgeworth screamed, I wanted him to go deeper and guttural, whereas Phoenix I would allow him to go screechier and go up into his head. So where Phoenix would go higher, Edgeworth would go lower. And there were variances here and there, but generally speaking, I tried to keep them separate in that way so that when they both got into heightened emotions, they would still sound different. And even to the extent of the famous exclamations that they would exclaim, like objection, for instance. Objection is a word that they both say constantly, and I purposefully, before even starting to record either part, I made the decision I'm going to pronounce this word a little bit differently depending on which person I'm doing. With Phoenix, I wanted him to pronounce it objection, with all the emphasis, most of the emphasis really on the second syllable, which is the way you would normally say the word. But with Edgeworth, I wanted him to put more emphasis on that first syllable, objection. So really hitting the and you still have to hit the second syllable a little bit or it doesn't sound like the word objection, but it fit Edgeworth's accent to put all the emphasis on the first syllable, and so that just helped differentiate the characters all the more, so that when Phoenix yells, objection, you get that, and then when Edgeworth goes, objection, there is a slight difference. And that was all very purposeful on my part, in differentiating these characters, so to justify me playing both roles.